Imagine a ship after a violent storm. Its sails torn, its hull cracked, its crew scattered. The ocean is suddenly quiet, but the silence feels heavier than the storm itself. Many survivors of narcissistic relationships know this silence well. The moment after the chaos, when the noise stops, and what remains is a broken vessel that still somehow floats. That's what it feels like to wake up after a trauma bond. You're alive, but altered. You may wonder, did I lose a partner, or did I lose the script I was unconsciously following? This is the question that begins the real journey. Not the story of who left you, but the map of who you are becoming in their shadow. If you feel disoriented, you're not weak. The collapse of a toxic bond often feels like a shipwreck, but a shipwreck is also a map. What breaks apart shows you what was never seaworthy. The pieces that remain become material for salvage. And salvage, if approached with patience, becomes the chart of a new course. The grief is real. And grief, when you let it breathe, is not a verdict on your worth. It's information. It tells you what mattered, where you invested yourself, what parts of you were neglected, and what parts now ache to be reclaimed. Astonishment belongs here too. Astonishment that you endured, that you can still feel, that your nervous system, exhausted though it may be, has not abandoned you. Jung might remind us that the collapse of a persona, of an identity tied too closely to another, is often the doorway to individuation. And if we look at culture's oldest stories, we find the same pattern. Odysseus returns home after years of storms and battles. But when he arrives, his home is not what it was, nor is he the same man. To survive is not to return to the old life. It is to claim authorship of a new one. Here is the promise for this journey together. By the end of these developments, you will hold in your hands 2 practical rituals, simple enough to begin in the next days, powerful enough to measure change in 3 weeks, and 1 diagnostic test to see whether the pull of the trauma bond still lingers in your system. For now, breathe into this truth. You are the helmsman of a damaged but unsunk vessel. The storm has passed, but the navigation has just begun. So let's ask, when the mirror breaks, who sails the hull? When you loved a narcissist, you may have felt like you were looking into a mirror that reflected back only fragments of yourself. That mirror was not showing your wholeness. It was reflecting what the other person needed, distorted by their hunger for admiration and control. In time, your own outline blurred. The reflection became more real than the self. This is the hidden wound that emerges after the storm. The empath's tendency to erase their own contours in order to keep love intact. Many men recognize this pattern in themselves long after the breakup. The subtle habit of shrinking, of silencing opinions, of praising qualities in the partner that were often more projection than reality. The image was never stable because it was not just them you were looking at. It was your desire, your longing, your unspoken need for approval filling in the gaps. Jung described projection as the unconscious act of placing qualities of our own psyche onto others. Attachment theory gives us the structural engine, the anxious bond that makes proximity feel like survival. When you carried a wound from a caregiver whose approval was conditional, your nervous system learned that to be safe was to become small, to mirror the other rather than risk rejection. And in the arms of a narcissist, that wound found fertile ground. Their craving for validation met your craving to provide it. 2 half-truths locked into a pattern that looked like devotion, but was, in reality, erasure. The paradox is that what feels like compassion often begins as an algorithm of survival. Hyperempathy is not just kindness, it is vigilance learned in childhood, sharpened by the need to read a parent's moods or to calm a volatile environment. That same vigilance, repurposed in adulthood, becomes identity. And when you stop performing it, it can feel like cruelty. You fear becoming cold. Yet restraint is not coldness, it is mastery. To reduce projection is to return to proportion. Consider a man who spent 4 years in a trauma bond. He thought he was a rescuer, always attentive, always ready to soothe his partner's storms. Only later did he see that this impulse was not about her at all. It was his father's absence reenacted, the silent hope that if he could be good enough, attentive enough, no one would ever leave him again. What looked like love was a younger part of him begging to be noticed. His rescue was not hers to receive. It was his own inner child waiting to be met. There is an old myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who carved a statue and fell in love with it. In the narcissistic bond, the roles invert. You become the sculpture, molding yourself around another's desires. You forget that you were once the sculptor of your own life. The work now is not to destroy the statue, but to step back into the role of artist, to reclaim authorship of the image, instead of serving as someone else's reflection. In this stage of recovery, astonishment helps. The astonishment that what you thought was selfless compassion was, in fact, a protective pattern. The astonishment that reducing projection, praising less, observing more, setting one small boundary, is not an act of hostility, but an act of self-return. This is where the first map is drawn from the wreckage. When the mirror shatters, the question is no longer, who do they see in me? But, what qualities have I hidden in them that are waiting to be recognized as mine? There is a word that often gets confused for destiny: chemistry. That electric pull, the rush of attraction that feels like fire under the skin. For many empaths, this chemistry is the very thing that bound them to the narcissist, long after the relationship showed itself to be unsafe. It was not love. It was a loop. In the nervous system, reward is not neutral. It has memory. When you were a child facing inconsistency, a parent who was present one moment and withdrawn the next, your body learned to crave not stability, but the unpredictable rush of connection. That craving becomes an adult pattern. You recognize it in the hot and cold cycle, the unanswered messages followed by sudden floods of attention, the inconsistency that keeps you off balance but also strangely alive. What feels like passion is often intermittent reinforcement. Neuroscience explains it plainly. The dopamine system is designed to spike in anticipation, not in certainty. That means the very lack of consistency can make the bond feel stronger. The pain of absence, followed by the relief of return, wires the nervous system into addiction. Add oxytocin, the hormone of bonding released during intimacy, and the chemistry is sealed. It is not fate. It is biology hijacked by trauma. Jung would call this a reenactment of a wound. The anima or animus projection often arrives with force, as if a lost part of the soul has finally appeared in human form. But what the psyche calls homecoming is often the echo of childhood's unfinished business. You fall not into love, but into memory. The familiar ache of inconsistency feels magnetic because your body has been trained to equate it with care. The counterintuitive truth is that intensity does not equal safety. The fact that your body craves someone is not proof that they are good for you. Desire is not a compass. It is a signal, and sometimes that signal points backward, toward the unresolved. Consider the testimony of men who noticed that the high of returning to a narcissistic partner felt indistinguishable from other rewards, winning a game, closing a deal, reaching a fitness milestone. Once they began replacing the compulsive cycle with deliberate mastery, learning an instrument, training with focus, building something concrete, they saw the cravings for the partner diminish. The nervous system found new ways to seek reward. The lie of chemistry unraveled. This is where the empath begins to see the trap clearly. The bond was never proof of soul connection. It was a learning loop, and loops can be rewired. Not by force, not by denial, but by introducing new patterns of reward that the body begins to trust. What once felt like irresistible attraction slowly reveals itself for what it was, the nervous system searching for the rhythm of childhood. There is grief in admitting this. The grief of realizing that what you thought was destiny was often dependency. Yet there is also freedom. If chemistry is not fate, then you are not doomed to repeat it. You can unlearn. You can rewire. The craving itself becomes information, pointing you to where the nervous system still confuses danger with love. And so the question shifts. When the rush comes, when chemistry strikes, what if instead of asking, "Is this the one?" you asked, "What pattern in me is this lighting up?" When the empath looks back at the relationship, one of the hardest truths to face is this. Much of what was called love was, in reality, a trauma bond. It is painful to say, but liberating to see. The cycle of chaos, relief, and craving was not affection freely given and received. It was a pattern, precise, repeatable, and binding. At the root lies an archetype many men carry without noticing, the savior fused with the inner orphan. As children, some were asked to take responsibility too early, to become caretakers in families that needed rescuing. The nervous system learned to find worth in being useful, in being the one who calms, fixes, or absorbs the storm. This wound often reappears in adult relationships as codependency, mistaking the act of saving for the experience of loving. Psychology names the cycle clearly. A trauma bond forms through intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation of fear and relief. Your partner withdraws, you feel panic, and then their sudden return floods you with relief. That relief, though fleeting, imprints deeply, convincing the body that the relationship is necessary for survival. What looks from the outside like loyalty is, on the inside, a loop of fear and temporary calm. Jung might frame this as shadow work left undone. The rejected parts of the psyche, shame, fear of abandonment, guilt for saying no, remain unintegrated. So the empath lives them out through the bond, hoping to repair in the present what was wounded in the past. But repair through repetition does not heal. It entangles. Here is the counterintuitive insight. Withholding rescue is sometimes the most compassionate act. When the empath stops leaping in to soothe every crisis, they break the cycle not only for themselves, but also for the partner. To refuse to rescue is not rejection. It is clarity. It is a signal to both nervous systems that chaos will not be rewarded. There is myth in this pattern too. Prometheus brought fire to humanity, but in giving what was not his to give, he condemned himself to punishment. The empath who endlessly rescues often suffers a similar fate, bound to a cycle of exhaustion, shame, and depletion. Nietzsche offered a different lens, amor fati, the love of one's fate, to accept limits as moral clarity, not as failure. The empath's no becomes an act of integrity, not of cruelty. Imagine the test of refusing just once. A request for rescue arrives, a late-night crisis, a sudden plea, and instead of rushing in, the empath notices the surge of shame that floods the body. In that pause, something radical happens. The shame is named rather than obeyed. The orphan inside is recognized. The savior archetype loosens its grip. Afterward, the landscape changes. Sometimes the partner escalates, sometimes they retreat, but either outcome offers information. The bond no longer operates invisibly. It becomes visible, chartable, like a map. And once a map is drawn, the path home is possible. So the question emerges, if love is not rescuing, what form does it take? And if worth is not earned by absorbing chaos, where will the empath root their identity? When the mirror has shattered and the trauma bond is mapped, the question that rises is one of sovereignty. What does it mean to rule one's own inner kingdom after years of living at the mercy of another's moods? For the empath, this is the pivot, moving from reactivity to agency, from being shaped by the storm to becoming the helmsman of the vessel. Beneath the surface lies another wound, the wound of permission-seeking. Many men who identify as empaths know this texture well. It is the subtle hesitation before making a decision, the way the body tenses under evaluation, the quiet longing to be needed so that insecurity can be soothed. These patterns often trace back to a father who was absent, or only conditionally present. Approval was a currency, never a given, and so the boy learned to seek permission before moving, to doubt his own authority. Psychology offers a framework here. Self-determination. Theory reminds us that human beings thrive on three needs: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. The narcissistic bond undermines all three. Competence is questioned, autonomy is eroded, and relatedness is reduced to dependence. To rebuild sovereignty is not to cut off these needs, but to reclaim them. Neuroscience supports the path. Small, repeated actions reshape reward pathways. The nervous system learns, over time, that safety and satisfaction can come from self-directed rituals rather than reactive cycles. Here is the paradox worth holding. Discipline is not the suppression of feeling. It is the structure that allows freedom. Restraint does not shrink life. It expands choice. Think of a river without banks. It floods and destroys. Give it boundaries, and it becomes a current strong enough to sustain cities. The empath, without discipline, floods their own life with the currents of others. With discipline, they regain flow, direction, and power. One man, after the collapse of an abusive bond, rebuilt his days not with grand gestures, but with rituals. In the morning, he wrote down a single non-relational goal, something that belonged only to his work, his body, or his craft. At midday, he practiced 2 boundary lines aloud, as if rehearsing for a future he had once feared. In the evening, he anchored himself with cold water or with breath, reminding his nervous system that he could face discomfort without collapsing. Over time, these small practices rewired his sense of self. The chase for validation diminished. The sovereignty returned. Philosophy deepens the frame. Nietzsche spoke of telos, a purpose that acts like gravity, pulling life into form. For the empath, discipline is not about rigidity, but about orienting toward a telos, a chosen purpose that replaces the reactive role of rescuer. Each ritual becomes a quiet declaration. I am no longer waiting for permission. I am shaping myself toward my own horizon. And so the empath transforms. No longer a reactive mirror, no longer a rescuer bound by shame, but a sovereign, one who acts with intention, who responds with clarity, who is free not because he resists feeling, but because he gives feeling a container. The question then sharpens. What rituals, repeated with devotion, could remind you daily that sovereignty is not granted by others, but reclaimed from within? There comes a moment in recovery when the empath realizes that the qualities most despised in the narcissist, the arrogance, the silence, the bursts of rage, are not entirely foreign. They live, in muted form, inside the self. To deny them completely is to project them endlessly. To integrate them is to reclaim power. Jung named this process shadow work. The shadow is not evil. It is simply what the conscious self has disowned. For many empaths, that shadow contains aggression, entitlement, or unapologetic desire. As children, they learned that such traits were dangerous, that to express them would lead to rejection or punishment, and so they buried them. But what is buried does not disappear. It waits, surfacing in distorted ways through relationships. The narcissist becomes a carrier of the qualities the empath cannot yet admit belong to their own psyche. Neuroscience gives a practical angle. Emotion regulation involves the prefrontal cortex, rehearsing new responses until they become natural. When an empath practices reappraisal, finding contexts where anger or assertiveness are not destructive but protective, the brain slowly rewires. Healthy anger becomes available as a resource rather than a threat. Entitlement reshapes into self-respect. Silence transforms into measured presence. The counterintuitive truth here is that integrating shadow qualities does not mean condoning abuse. It means reclaiming the raw energy that was once exiled and assigning it ethical boundaries. To integrate rage is to allow oneself to feel it fully without turning it into harm. To integrate entitlement is to claim space without trespassing on another's. To integrate silence is to rest in power, not to withhold it as punishment. Myth offers images for this process. Hercules faced the Nemean lion, a beast that no weapon could pierce. He did not slay it from afar. He entered its cave, grappled with it directly, and used his own strength to subdue it. The empath's shadow is much the same. It cannot be destroyed by denial. It must be wrestled with, brought close, and mastered. And mastery is not becoming the beast. It is learning to wear its skin without losing one's humanity. Consider the cultural caution of a story like There Will Be Blood. Ambition untethered from ethics becomes destruction. The empath's task is to avoid this path, to bind shadow energy with integrity, to step into assertiveness, anger, and power not as weapons, but as instruments of balance. In the arc of healing, this stage is both frightening and liberating. Frightening, because it means acknowledging, I carry within me what I most hated in them. Liberating, because once that truth is spoken, projection no longer dictates attraction. Healthier partners appear when the qualities once denied are consciously held. And so, the empath, once terrified of becoming the narcissist, finds a deeper clarity. Integration is not imitation. To integrate is to reclaim. To reclaim is to choose. The question now becomes, what part of the shadow, once despised in another, is quietly waiting to be rehomed inside you, not as a curse, but as a source of strength? The storm has passed, the wreckage examined, and the maps redrawn. The empath who once lived as a mirror, as a rescuer, as a vessel tossed by someone else's tides, now stands at a new threshold. Sovereignty begins here, not as perfection, not as a fixed identity, but as authorship. The arc has unfolded in 5 movements. First, the recognition that projection kept you small, that your reflection in another was never the whole truth. Then, the unveiling of chemistry as a dopamine loop, a nervous system trick that bound you to intensity rather than safety. Next came the exposure of codependency as a mask for trauma bonds, the realization that rescuing was not love but reenactment. After that, the rebuilding of inner sovereignty, where discipline became scaffolding for freedom. And finally, the integration of the shadow lover, reclaiming anger, silence, and power as parts of you, ethically held and no longer exiled. Recovery is not abstract. It leaves measurable traces. Craving scores drop as the nervous system no longer confuses danger with intimacy. Boundaries, once shaky, become consistent lines held with calm. Rituals practiced across 21 days reshape not only habits, but the very pathways of reward. Each marker is a constellation, faint at first, but reliable. The emotional analogy is this: a man at sea with his maps burned, staring at the night sky. At first, the stars are only points of light, scattered and overwhelming. But slowly, patterns emerge. The constellations form. Navigation returns. He is still alone on the water, but no longer lost. He has learned to read the stars. 2 steps remain close at hand. Begin with a single mirror audit. 1 moment of noticing what qualities you once saw only in them that belong also to you. Then, try 1 containment line in the next day, letting your nervous system feel the surge of shame and breathe through it. These are not grand gestures. They are coordinates, small but precise, charting the path out of the storm. And 1 ethical anchor steadies the course. No contact decisions must rest on observed behavior across time, not on hope or longing. 30 days of reality weigh more than 30 years of wish. So the ship sails on, battered but not sunk. And you, the helmsman, guide it not by old maps, but by stars that were always there, waiting to be seen. The open question now is this: when you look at the night sky of your own life, which constellation will you choose to navigate by?